Good morning to all my esteemed listeners. Welcome to Biblical Perspectives 2013, a social commentary of today's burning issues as viewed from the lens of the Bible. This is Nene Rubrico, your host. This program is brought to you by languageslings.org, the leading resource for educational material in the internet on Philippine languages such as Cebuano by Dr. Jesse Gracio Rubrico, linguist consultant, and the family of Engineer Eldefonso Haencio Rubrico. The views expressed in this program are solely the commentators and do not necessarily reflect those of this station. Before we were interrupted in our series of discussions on the topic Faith and the Problem of Evil, based on the book of Mr. Lee Strobel, because we traveled out of town to attend a funeral of a family member, and on our way back experienced a number of breakdowns in the van we were riding in, and finally got the devastating news about a major earthquake in Bohol and the plight of my daughter-in-law's relatives and friends there. I could not help but reflect how all of these events can convince people that anything good can come out of pain and suffering. Yet I witnessed in my own sister-in-law and her husband the pain and grief of losing their eldest child at the prime of her life. How they are coping with their loss, and we who are still living in this imperfect world are sometimes at a loss of words how we can bring them comfort from the depths of their sorrow. Before the death of their daughter, Hope, my sister-in-law's family had to cope with a seriously injured son who had crashed his motorcycle while driving to work. The motorcycle suffered a front tire explosion, and it was fortunate the son was driving at moderate speed only. Still, it would take months of rehabilitation before he can be considered fit again, and perhaps thousands of pesos in restorative surgery. Just a few days after his motorcycle crash, Hope, his sister, unexpectedly died. When it rains, it is a downpour. When it rains, it floods is an expression more and more people now use not only to describe the situation of Metro Manila and many parts of the country, but also the tragedies, major and minor, that seem to arrive at the most inconvenient times of their lives. What then? At the risk of sounding preachy or even dogmatic in this program, the people of great faith in the past and today are telling us we need to turn to God. A pastor friend of Mr. Lee Strobel, the author of the book The Case for Faith, knew this in a very personal way. After a snowstorm, Pastor Mark was shoveling the snow out of their driveway to prepare the family for going to church. His wife told him to watch out for their young daughter as she backed out their car, and Mark said okay. It was then that their worst nightmare began. Somehow, their little child ran across and was caught under the rear wheel as her mother began to back up the car. Like the African woman who held her dying daughter in her arms, Pastor Mark also held his child as life slowly ebbed away from her. So deep was Mark's initial despair that he had to ask God to help him breathe, to help him eat, to help him function at the most basic level of existence. Otherwise, he was paralyzed by deep emotional pain. But increasingly, he felt God's presence, His grace, His warmth, His comfort, and very slowly, over time, Mark's wounds began to heal. Having experienced God at his highest point of need, Mark began to emerge from this terrible trial a changed person, leaving a career in business to devote his time to attend seminary and become a pastor. Through his suffering, even though he never would have chosen it, though it was so painful and life-shattering, Mark has been transformed into someone who would devote the rest of his life to bringing the compassion of God to others who are alone in their desperation. Speaking at the pulpit for the first time, Mark was able to draw in his own experiences with God in the depths of sorrow. People were captivated because his own loss had given him special insights, credibility, and empathy. In the end, many of his listeners responded by saying they too wanted to know this God, this Jesus, this God of tears. Today, many hearts are healed because Pastor Mark's heart had been broken. From one parent's despair emerged a new hope for many. The mother of Hope, our niece, is a government employee, a board top-notcher in the health sciences, and who could have become a high provincial or regional official had she moved closer to the centers of power. The mother who had, by choice to date, spent 35 years of her productive life serving a poor community in Biliran Island. She had this to say to us: I have yielded my daughter to God. She is in a better place now, as we all will soon follow. I am both sad and happy for Hope, but in the end, I am happy for her. Sometimes people scoff at the Bible, saying that God can cause good to emerge from our pain if we run toward Him instead of away from Him, testifies Pastor Mark. But I've watched it happen in my own life. I've experienced God's goodness through deep pain, and no skeptic can dispute this. The God who the skeptic denies is the same God who held our hands in the deep, dark places, who strengthened our marriage, who deepened our faith, who increased our reliance on Him, who gave us 2 more children, and who infused our lives with new purpose and meaning so that we can make a difference to others. Asked if he wished he had more answers about why suffering happens in the first place, Pastor Mark replied, We live in a broken world. Jesus was honest enough to tell us we would have trials and tribulations. From John 16:33, Jesus says, These things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you have tribulations, but take courage, I have overcome the world. Unquote. Sure, says Mark, I would like to understand more about why, but Dr. Kripp's conclusion is correct. The ultimate answer is the presence of Jesus. That may sound corny, but wait, when your world is being rocked, you don't want philosophy or theology as much as you want the reality of Christ. He was the answer for me. He is the answer we needed. Indeed, the existence of pain and suffering are powerful accusations against God. The question, however, is whether the evidence succeeds in convicting God of this accusation. Dr. Kreff's deft analysis and answers and analogies go a long way toward undermining one formidable obstacle to faith, pain. But there are many other objections that have remained. In fact, there are 7 other objections to faith, and we will take these up one by one along the way. The prominent British pastor and theologian who died last year wrote that he acknowledged that the greatest challenge to the Christian faith is suffering. The Reverend John W. Stott says, he's concluded that I have never myself believed in God if it were not for the cross. In the real world of pain, how could one worship a God who is immune to it? I have entered many Buddhist temples in different Asian countries and stood respectfully before the statue of Buddha, his legs crossed, arms folded, eyes closed, and the ghost of a smile playing round his mouth, a remote look on his face detached from the agonies of the world. But each time after a while, I have had to turn away, and in imagination I have turned instead to that lonely, twisted, torture figure on the cross, nails through hands and feet, back lacerated, lens wrenched, brow bleeding from torn pricks, mouth dry and intolerably thirsty, plunged in God-forsaken darkness. That is the God for me. He laid aside his immunity to pain. He entered our world of flesh and blood, tears and death. He suffered for us. Our sufferings become more manageable in the light of his own sufferings. There is still a question mark against human suffering, to be sure, but over it we boldly stamp another mark, the cross, which symbolizes divine suffering. The cross of Christ is God's only self-justification in such a world as ours. Unquote. For those who are interested to examine with me the question of faith in the light of our suffering in the world, here are the other objections. Objection number 2. Since miracles contradict science, miracles cannot be true. Objection number 3. Evolution explains life, so God is not needed. Objection number 4. God isn't worthy of worship if he kills innocent children. Objection number 5. It's offensive to claim Jesus is the only way to God. Objection number 6. A loving God would never torture people in hell. Objection number 7. Church history is full of histories of oppression and violence. And finally, objection number 8. I still have my doubts, so I can't be a Christian. We will tackle each objection in the course of our series, but today we will tackle briefly the introduction of objection number 2. Since miracles contradict science, they cannot be true. The most prominent atheist of our time, the Nobel Prize winner in biochemistry, says the virgin birth, the resurrection, the raising of Lazarus from the dead, even the Old Testament miracles are all freely used for religious propaganda, and they are very effective with an audience of unsophisticates and children. Gary Habermas, an award-winning author of Christian books, wrote, "It is not just a provocative rumor that God has acted in history, but a fact worthy of our own intellectual conviction. The miracles of Christianity are not an embarrassment to the Christian worldview. Rather, they are testimony to the compassion of God for human beings benighted by sin and circumstance." We will have more of these discussions, but my time is up. We will continue this next time. Once again, this is Nene Rubrico reminding you that where there is no vision, the people perish. God bless you.